We have covered a lot of information in this series in talking about how we got the Bible. We've talked about biblical claims for inspiration, that the Bible frequently does claim to be inspired of God. We talked about what is known as the canon of Scripture, the 66 books that we have in the Bible. Do we have confidence that we have the right 66 books? Well, in the sessions on canonicity, we were able to demonstrate that yes, we do in fact have the right 66 books. But we also dealt with another challenge called the transmission of the Bible text. It has been charged that since we do not have any of the originals, all we have are copies of copies, that the Bible has been hopelessly corrupted through centuries of copying and recopying. But we were able to demonstrate scientifically how that is not at all the case, that we have every reason to believe that the Bible was in fact accurately copied. So accurate that scholars today believe that our Hebrew and Greek texts are 99.9% true to the original. But this leaves us with one more important aspect to how we got the Bible, and that's translation. We noted that the Bible was originally written in 3 languages, in Hebrew, in Aramaic, and Greek. How many of us are proficient in any of these languages? There are few today who are. Therefore, we are dependent upon their doing a good, reliable job of translating the original text into English. We must remember that having the Bible translated into many different languages was God's plan all along. The Great Commission given by Jesus in Matthew 28:18-20 demands that the gospel be taken to the whole world. Well, in order to do this, it's going to have to be translated. On the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, the day the church began, the gospel message was translated into the dialects of the people in attendance. Therefore, we should acknowledge that God wanted His original word to be translated into every language of mankind, including English. So let's talk about the origins of the English Bible. Today we have literally dozens of English translations. How did we get to this point? The journey of the Bible from the original languages to modern-day English is a fascinating and sometimes controversial story. It is, however, an interesting and an important story. This is what is known as an ivory diptych. It has figures carved on sides of an altar of an ancient Roman church. When the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, learning was incredibly low. People were scattered, no central government, wars were everywhere, and people did not go to school. They were basically in survival mode. The church was virtually the only organization that educated people, and usually it was for the purpose of having a select few read their manuscripts. The only way people knew anything about the Bible was what they were told and taught, and this teaching was done mostly in pictures. As we look at this ivory diptych, we can just imagine how the people would gather around it as one of the churchmen would explain the Bible story that's depicted. In this example, we have the following miracles of Jesus depicted. We have Him feeding of the 5,000, the raising of Lazarus, the healing of the blind man, the healing of the paralytic, the turning water into wine. You can imagine as people would learn the Bible stories by looking at things like this ivory diptych. The officials of the church during the first several centuries after the time of Christ first spoke and read Greek. Eventually, Latin became the language spoken by most in all of Europe. Here is what is known as a medieval picture Bible. It was like a comic book depicting some scenes with Latin captions, which most could not read. It had to be explained to them. There are many misconceptions that arose from works like this. For example, notice the people are dressed like Roman monks of the 3rd century AD. That's not the way the Jews looked in the 1st century. They have hairstyles of Romans, not 1st century Jews. The furniture is not at all typical of a Jewish household. There were also doctrinal misconceptions. On the second circle on the right shows an infant being baptized. Well, this practice is not at all taught in the New Testament. It's a practice that did not begin until the 3rd or 4th century AD. The story of the English Bible includes several famous men. First, it is a British monk by the name of Bede. He translated parts of the New Testament, which sadly have not survived. He died in 735 AD. He did, however, produce a work entitled A History of the English Church and People, in which he describes the efforts of the church to communicate the Bible to people in English. He tells of a man named CAEDMON, an English monk from the monastery at Whitby in York. CAEDMON put Bible stories into Old English verse. Here is an example of CAEDMON's work. It reads, Ne beoth ge thy forthrin, the Farron brothe, which in modern English says, be not frightened thereat, though Pharaoh has brought. And then he says, sword vingendra, orla unrim, well, sword wielders, vast troops. And then it goes on to say, he elim vili mithin driften thurn mein hand, to dage thyssen daglien gifen. Well, that in modern English, to them all will the mighty Lord through my hand this very day recompense give. It was through poems like this that the people learned the Bible stories. But some observations need to be made. First, this is not a translation of the Bible, but a Bible event that's being put into a poetic story. Here we saw illustrated the story of God's deliverance of the Israelites from the Egyptians. Second, believe it or not, this is English. However, this Old English would have to be translated for us today. Another man by the name of Aldhelm, the Bishop of Sherborne in Dorset, translated the Psalms into English shortly after 700 AD. After that, there were more serious attempts to provide English to the people. This was typically done in an interlinear style, where a Latin manuscript would have the English written between the lines. Here is an example of one of the Lindisfarne Gospels, a Latin manuscript that dates approximately 698 AD. It's the front piece for the Gospel of Mark. Inside, we can see how each verse was translated into English, and so you have both the Latin and the English transliteration. While great progress is being made in translating the Bible into English, there was still much that needed to be done. Around 1000 AD, the first independent English translation was completed. It is known as the Wessex Gospels. Look at the first couple of lines. It reads, Sothlice ut auda hisana hisan tisan, and tata hiso summa hisvelen with vague, and fuglas common and atenta. Well, again, that's English. While we might recognize some of the words, it is still a far cry from modern English. Well, the Norman conquest of 1066 brought great changes to English culture. Norman French was mixed with spoken English, so that before long, the English of the Wessex Gospels was unintelligible to the masses of English people. Moving forward a few hundred years, we learn about a man by the name of John Wycliffe that lived in 1329 to 1384. He came to teach at the University of Oxford in England. He was a Catholic priest and the most learned man of his day. But he had trouble with his own people and with the Catholic Church because his personal study had convinced him that all people ought to read the Bible for themselves and that they had that right. He also believed that people could not read the Bible unless it was in their own language or in their own tongue. So he set about to translate with his secretary, a man by the name of John Purvey, the Bible into English. Here is a portion of Wycliffe's translation. Notice how different this is from the way we speak today. However, we are getting closer. He said, "These things Jesus spake, and when he had cast his eyes to heaven, he said, Father, the hour cometh, clarify the Son, that the Son clarify thee." Well, 100 years after Wycliffe, the Synod of Oxford in 1408 made it illegal in the country of England to either read or to translate the Bible into English without the express written permission from the diocese and the bishop. And they were not about to give that permission. Wycliffe dies in 1384 before they could kill him. However, many of his students, went out to preach the Bible, making it available to the common people. Sadly, many of them were killed in the years immediately following Wycliffe's death. As a result of this great persecution, little work was done on translating the Bible. Later in the 15th century, an amazing invention was made, an invention that would change the educational foundations of the world and impact the future of Bible translations. In 1450, the printing press was introduced into the world by Johannes Gutenberg. Before this, all copies were handwritten, but now it could be mass-produced. Even this was a very cumbersome and time-consuming process. This press had to be lifted up and every letter typeset just for one page. And then they could put a piece of paper in there, roll it down and make one copy. Then they would place another piece of paper in and so on. It was a very tedious process, but you could still produce more copies quicker and more accurately as long as the original typeset was correct. The first book to be printed was the Latin translation of the Bible in 1456. I have in my library a page produced by the Gutenberg press. Notice how this press was able to produce beautiful pages of the Bible text. As we look at this, we are amazed at the beautiful print, the font, the color. The Greek Bible was also printed in 1514 along with what is known as the Complutensian polyglot. Polyglot is a word that means multilingual. It was the best study tool of its day, and it provided the Hebrew text, the Septuagint, known as the LXX, with the Latin interlinear. It included the Latin Vulgate, Hebrew and Chaldaic roots, and Latin and Chaldaic translations. It was an amazing study tool. There were originally 600 of these produced, but only 2 are known to exist today. Erasmus, a scholar of Rotterdam, began to think about publishing the Greek text in printed form, so all could study the original text of the New Testament for themselves. He only had at his disposal a few manuscripts from the 12th and the 13th centuries. Based on those, he produced a printed Greek Testament. The Elsevier brothers of Leiden printed this Greek New Testament of Erasmus, and in their preface used the phrase Textus Receptus, because this was the text received by all. So this was the printed Greek Testament that was in use during the 14th to 16th centuries, again, based upon a few medieval manuscripts. It was the Greek text that was the basis for the King James Version. In Germany, Martin Luther and others were beginning to see that the Catholic Church practiced many things that contradicted biblical teaching. Through Luther's work and others, preaching in the churches became radically different. Now, instead of having Mass in Latin, which most of the people did not know or understand, they would come to worship and the entire service would be in a language they didn't even know. But now it was in the language of the common people. About this time, we learn about a man by the name of William Tyndale, who lived from 1494 to 1536. Early in the 1500s, William Tyndale began to have an interest in translating the Bible. He was living during the time of Martin Luther and the Great Reformation of Catholicism that was taking place all over Europe. He said that people deserve to have the Bible in their own tongue. One time he was in a heated discussion with a high official of the Catholic Church. Tyndale was expressing his views that the people needed to have the laws of God direct from the Bible, and they needed those laws of God in their own language. The Catholic official responded that it was more important that the people have the Pope's laws than God's laws. To this, Tyndale said, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. If God spare my life very many years, I will cause a boy that drives the plow to know more of the Scriptures than you do." Eventually, Catholic and secular authorities kidnapped him, they hanged him, and they burned his body at the stake in 1536. His last words were, "O Lord, open thou the King of England's eyes." He wanted people to realize that it was not a crime to read the Bible, that it should not cost someone their life because they're trying to get the Word of God into the hands of common people. Well, about 90% of the King James Version is Tyndale's translation. The King James translators just carried or they copied it over. This Bible here was probably the work of a man by the name of Miles Coverdale, who was not a Greek or Hebrew scholar. But the front piece is very revealing. It shows how people felt about the Bible and demonstrated how the Word was to be given to the people. In the top left, you've got Moses receiving the Ten Commandments. And the words say, "These are the laws that thou shalt lay before them." On the top right, Jesus and the apostles with the words, "Go ye everywhere and preach the gospel." So we've got Jesus giving them the Great Commission. On the bottom left, you've got Ezra with the book of the law, reading and explaining it to the people from Nehemiah chapter 8. And then in the bottom right, Peter and the apostles on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2. Well, they were speaking the gospel in the language of the people. The main idea was that the Bible belongs to the people in their own language. And so you might say that this particular Bible it's making a statement that the Bible has always belonged to the people, that God's intention from throughout biblical history was for the Bible to be that which is in the language of the common people. The Great Bible, which was one that came along a little bit later, was one that received a lot of attention. The Coverdale Bible, which was mainly the work of Tyndale, was not well accepted. But the Great Bible was. It was called that because it was so big. Notice Henry VIII pictured on the front piece of the Bible. At the bottom, the people are saying, "Vivat Rex, Vivat Rex, long live the king." This Bible dates around 1539, 3 years after Tyndale was killed, though much of this was Tyndale's work. But the fact that the king was pictured on the front of it was one reason why it was so successful. He liked the fact that his picture was on the front. And the Bible was successful only because it was authorized by the king and it was pushed through politically. The Geneva Bible came about in 1536. It was the first Bible to use verse numbers. It also included extensive marginal notes. Now, Stephen Langton, a professor at the University of Paris, was the one that divided the Bible into the modern chapter divisions, and that was at 1227 AD. So you can see that the idea of the Bible being divided into chapters and verses is something that came along well after the time that the Bible books were written. They are not inspired of God, but they are actually the work of men trying to help the Bible be something that is easier to read and to understand. So 1200s for the dividing of the Bible into chapters, and the 1500s for the Bible being divided into verses. We need to talk about the Council of Trent that took place in 1546. This was a Catholic conference that was designed to meet the ever-growing dissatisfaction with the Catholic Church. They recognized, the Catholic officials, that they needed to do something, that the tide was turning against them. See, there was serious political and religious upheaval at the time, and the Roman Catholic Church legislated that all men should accept the Apocrypha as part of the Holy Scriptures, or be anathema from God. Interestingly, they only accepted 11 of the 14 apocryphal writings. The people, however, who knew Hebrew and Greek, knew that these books did not belong with the Bible because all of the best manuscripts had excluded them. The Catholics eventually decided that they needed to produce their own Bible that included the Apocrypha. So in 1610, they came out with what is known as the Rheims DOUAY version of the Bible. This version was used in part to counter the negative comments against Catholicism found in the Protestant Bibles. When Queen Mary was on the throne, she was pro-Catholic. Therefore, she restricted the reading of the Bible. When Queen Elizabeth was on the throne, she was pro-Protestant and put the Bibles back into the churches. This allowed the people to come to the churches and read the Bible for themselves. Frequently, those Bibles had to be chained to the pulpits to protect it. History records that long lines would form outside the church buildings, with people waiting hours for their turn to read the Bible for themselves. They were given a period of time, some have estimated around a few minutes, maybe 15 minutes, to read the Bible for themselves. How many today would stand in line for 2, 3, or 4 hours just to read the Bible for a few minutes? How many today would give their lives so that others would have the right to read their Bible in their own language, or even better, to own their own Bible? Think about how precious the Word was to them. We should learn from this. How many Bibles do you own? I know when I look at the number of Bibles I have in my home, I have a lot. And these are people that sacrifice so very much to get us to this point, to get us to the point where we can have our own Bibles. And so we're very, very blessed today to own our own Bibles, to have them so beautifully bound, all 66 books together in one volume that's really relatively, it's priced in a relatively cheap way. It's just amazing that we're in the condition that we are today. But how many people read the Bible? Studies have shown, as we've said earlier, that fewer and fewer people are reading this book, but yet the history of the English Bible shows the sacrifices of so many that have got us to this point. I think they would probably be ashamed to know that the Bible is not given the due that it deserves when they sacrifice so much for us to have Bibles. In the early 1600s, there were several Bibles that had been made. There was the Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible, Coverdale Bible, Tyndale, Wycliffe, the Protestant Bible, the Rheims DOUAY Bible, which was the Catholic Bible, and all of them with different footnotes, and many of these Bibles were produced with inflammatory notes about the doctrines of Catholicism or Protestantism. So in 1604, King James VI of Scotland decided there needed to be a uniform and accepted translation of the Bible that all England could use. Unlike previously printed Bibles, it would be free of marginal notes. So it was not going to have anything that was going to argue against Catholic doctrine or Protestant doctrine. It was just going to be a simple translation of the Bible text. This enabled the Bible to be more readily accepted by both Protestants and Catholics. Their original goal was to produce a Bible for the Anglican churches. As we know, however, the King James Version ended up having a much wider scope of influence. So from 1604 to 1611, some 47 scholars labored under the Royal Commission to translate the Bible into the common tongue of the English people. This begins the era into modern translations. When we begin the next session, then we'll talk about translation and the many translations that we have of the Bible in modern English.